Okay, hello. So this is a talk about marine preservation in Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. That's me. That's a photo of me. There's my email address and my website that needs to be updated. So let's get started. So just some context here: the history of marine preservation, marine preserves. There's very little done on this topic by historians. Obviously, marine history in general is somewhat of a new topic, and no one's really studied marine preservation, at least from the perspective of sort of the construction of the environmental regulatory state, um, from the perspective of sort of environmental activism, which is what I'm doing. There are some articles by marine scientists surveying these efforts, and here's a couple of them right here. My work is really focusing on Florida and on the state level efforts in beginning in the late 1950s, going into the 70s. I have an article on this topic coming out in the Florida Historical Quarterly focusing on Lee County on the West Coast. This talk is going to be focusing on the East Coast. And then there's also a lot of stuff at the national level starting in the 70s. Most of this is state federal partnerships. They're not well funded or supported. But Florida is active in many of these as well. And so that's sort of the next phase of research that I'm looking at. Today, we're going to talk about Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, which is the nation's first wildlife refuge, established in 1903 by Teddy Roosevelt. It was just this tiny little island. It used to be 5.5 acres. It's now 3 1/3 acres because of erosion and other factors. The size of the island has decreased. It's a very historically important refuge. It's the first wildlife refuge. It's also a really important birding site, a very important site for Audubon. You can see in this photo all the birds that are there. Here's some more just to give you a sense of where this is in Florida. Here's Orlando up here, Melbourne, Vero Beach, Fort Pierce. It's kind of right over here. This is a historical photo of Pelican Island during the nesting season, taken by a warden, a wildlife refuge warden in the 60s. Um, so, like I said, it started off as this 5.5 acre island. In the 1960s, it was expanded to protect the surrounding waters. And so, what I'm interested in is how was it expanded and why was it expanded? And a lot of this has to do with questions about marine ecosystems. Obviously, marine ecosystems are very different than terrestrial ecosystems. And when you try to protect them or preserve them or manage them, you need a different set of political strategies. You need a different set of management structures. You can't simply take a management structure that might apply to a terrestrial environment, stick it onto a marine ecosystem. It's sort of complicated, and the political strategies need to be different as well. So we're talking about sort of this idea of marine environmentalism from the beginning. Even the late 50s, ecological ideas are very important. These activists are often situating their ideas in marine environments. They're making a lot of arguments about ecosystem services in the context of the commercial fish industry and tourism. I think a lot of this is really notable because it's very early examples of sort of environmental ideas, ecological ideas. Earth Day is 1970. This is way before Earth Day. And then in all of these different stories, you see a lot of different kind of novel preservationist strategies or management regimes. You don't really see it in this story so much, but a lot of times, activists and managers are kind of struggling with this question of how do you protect water, or even what are you protecting? Is it just the top? Is it the water column? Like what are the rules and regulations going to be, and how is that different from a terrestrial ecosystem? That's less the case here. This one I think is showing something else, and that's how, when you have a preservationist structure already in place, like a wildlife refuge, it's much easier to preserve more. This example is predicated on previous preservationist structures. Preservation sort of begets more preservation. I think you see this quite a bit in Florida in this story. Here is what Pelican Island looks like today. And so you can see here this tiny little dot is the original 5 acre island. Today it's about 5,000 acres, and this is there. It was added to in the 90s. These kind of a lot of the additions more recently have been on land, but this huge section of water is really protected by the late 1960s through this effort that I'm going to talk about. So there's a lot of local pressure for development in the local area, and a lot of these efforts to expand the refuge are a reaction against this. There were a number of real estate developers who wanted to develop in the area, And there was also an attempt to expand and widen A1A, which is a big highway running along the coast. And that's very common. Florida has a lot of coastal developments. And before the late 60s, it really was a free for all. It really was, you're a developer, come on in, we'll sell you some water really cheap. We'll let you dredge and fill all you want. We'll give you free fill. We'll set a bulkhead line for you wherever you want. The bulkhead line is the line to out which you can fill. And so you have these developers coming in, and I'll show you an example in a second, really just turning mangroves and salt marsh and seagrass beds and water into land, into development. And there's challenges to this beginning in the late 1950s. It really starts to change in the late 60s a little bit. This is a really good example of what I'm talking about. This is Boca Ciega Bay over on the west coast by St. Pete. And this is sort of an example that a lot of these activists are saying we don't want this to happen. We don't want a developer to come in, take all these seagrass beds, destroy them by taking all the fill out of here and creating these islands. Because you're not just destroying this mangrove or these islands, you're also destroying all of this because you need to get this fill from somewhere and you're getting it from over here. And so this is what's going on in Florida quite a bit. And beginning in the late 50s, people start to fight this. In 1959, the state of Florida gives a 10-year lease to Florida Audubon of between 500 and 1,600 acres of unsurveyed mangrove islands or flats in the Indian River around the Refuge. This is, you might notice, like 500 to 116 acres is they have no idea how much they're giving this in this lease. And that's because it's unsurveyed. They don't know how big it is. This is sort of a persistent issue in Florida marine and coastal preservation at this time. The biggest problem is here, none of this has been surveyed. They don't know where the mean high water line is. So the mean high water line is the divider between private lands and public waters. And no one knows where it is because Florida has so much coastline, and the coastline is so difficult to survey because it's mangroves and marsh and there's islands everywhere. They really don't know like where this stuff is. Local activists are very central to this, and then that doesn't really stop the efforts to develop. There's a big effort in '62 by this company called the Rio Corporation to try to change the bulkhead line. In response, local activists form an organization called the Indian River Preservation League, which is really composed of three sort of groups. The most important figure is probably Joe Michael, who's a major citrus grower in the area, an old Florida family. He really has the citrus community behind him. That's what this area is at this time. It's mostly citrus groves, and all these citrus farmers, big citrus farmers, really get behind this. I sort of think this is part of this desire to preserve the character of their community. They don't want some out of town real estate developer to come in and destroy the place where they grew up and they lived. Michael does a bunch of stuff. He creates a whole municipality to protect these waters. He also serves on this mosquito control board and tries to limit dredging and filling. Audubon plays a big role here. Tom Coxon is the president, and he's succeeded by Ken Morrison, who was a major national Audubon figure as well. And then a lot of biologists in different federal and state agencies support it. Obviously, Fish and Wildlife, which controls the refuge, is going to support it. And central to that effort is Art Marshall, who later becomes a major figure in Everglades preservation in the 90s. He's very active. This is totally unknown. No one really knows this about him, but he was very active in a lot of this marine preservation in the 60s and 70s. Commercial fishers usually supported this type of stuff as well. They understood that these bay bottoms and seagrass beds were the sort of, the nurseries and the feeding grounds for their species. So they kind of understood the ecological value of these habitats. They don't seem to have been very vocal in this particular issue, however. These groups by April 1963 are proposing a 99-year lease of almost 5,000 acres of waters and islands around Pelican Island. This is endorsed by 20 local groups and the Indian River County Commission. Ecological ideas are very central to this. This is a quote from Michael, and he's talking about a complex ecological unit. The bird life is dependent on these areas for feeding grounds. So, I mean, these arguments are totally grounded in ecological ideas, which is, 1963 is not super early for this stuff, but it's certainly before Earth Day, before what we typically think of as modern environmentalism. The state of Florida rejects this proposal and instead dedicate only the 7 islands, 422 acres, until 1969 to match that 10-year lease from 1959. So this is interesting. They're saying, okay, we'll protect the lands, but I don't think they really are thinking like protecting the water. What's the point of that? I don't think they really understand what the value of that is. I think they want to preserve this for possible development, and I think they also are sort of dismayed. Like 5,000 acres, that's a lot. So that's really notable to me. Those efforts to dredge and fill the waters continue. You have another organization, there's 2 different developers trying to do this. Both of them are kind of outside. Um, these are not people from the area. I think both of them are from Miami. And they're repeatedly trying to buy these lands and get dredge and fill permits. And finally, by the end of the year, the IIF, which is basically the cabinet, I don't have time to explain it, reject their reject their proposals due to these local activists. I'm just going to skip this. In 1967, they designated a wilderness. Approaching 1969, the leases are due to expire. There's a big hearing in 68. Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing a 25-year lease of that 5,000-acre section. A state rep, actually, who's a major marine preservation advocate in Florida, advocates for a 99-year lease. The governor supports a 25-year lease. They reach a compromise on a 10-year lease, renewable for 15 more years. Just really quick, the lease is renewed, and they do continue to expand it in the 90s. But this is sort of what it basically more or less what it's going to look like by 68, 69, not including these sort of areas on the mainland. So these people took this 3-acre or 5-acre tiny island that's a wildlife preserve and expanded it to 5,000 acres. Most of it is water. Most of it is marine, and it's subjected to the same sort of rules and regulations that you would see in any wildlife refuge. So really, kind of, and a lot of it is explicitly habitat protection, and a lot of it is explicitly we want to prevent this stuff from being dredged and filled and developed. At the same time this is going on, there's a parallel effort to protect these waters. This is happening a little bit later, but it's part of the same effort. All these people know each other. In 1969, 1970, there is a creation of an aquatic preserve system in the state. This is done by the Florida Cabinet in 69. It's enshrined in law in 75. 26 preserves are created. One overlaps with the Pelican Island Wildlife Refuge, and several of them are in the Indian River Lagoon area. And these are sort of kind of novel preservationist regimes. All they really do is ban dredge fill activities. They ban the setting of bulkhead lines. They really are a very sort of what I would say a light preservationist regime, a light management regime. They're really just banning the alteration of sort of the habitat, and they're not restricting any other activities. So that's very different than what you would see in a wildlife refuge, which is a much stricter management regime. This is the current system of aquatic preserves in Florida, minus one that was just created this year, which is over here. These are the 5 in the sort of Indian River Lagoon area. The second one overlaps with Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. Here's Pelican Island right here. This little dot is Pelican Island. And here you can see sort of a bigger map of this aquatic preserve, and you can see the wildlife refuge. And I think there's another really notable thing here, which is what I would sort of call the puzzle pieces approach to kind of marine preservation, or just preservation in general. You can see here a bunch of different management regimes, a bunch of different preserves and state parks, and there's the aquatic preserve and a wildlife refuge and a state park and a Pine Island Preserve, and that's sort of very typical of what you start to see in Florida along the coast. You have a lot of different management regimes, all protecting waters and coastal areas in different ways. Okay, well that's my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.